This week I am talking about the books I read in 2020, the vampire books I read in 2020, that I really, really liked. I consider them to be the best books that I read this year. Keep in mind, these are only the books that I actually finished reading this year. There are a few that I started reading this year that I have yet to finish, and those ones are not counted. Just as with last week's video concerning the worst books I read in 2020, I will have some cards up here in the corner linked to the video reviews I did for those books, just in case you haven't seen them before. Let's get started. This year happened to start off with a bang, considering my first of my 4-star books this year was Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. It's difficult to have as good of a book starting off as this one, especially when many of the other ones that follow it don't always live up to the hype. The whole premise of the book is that you are listening in on an interview with Louis de Pointe-du-Lac, who is the vampire of the story, with the boy, as he's called in this book, who is a young man who has agreed to interview this vampire. And as a consequence, the entire book is pretty much dialogue, almost the entirety of it, which does turn some people off. I do understand why that is. We're not used to reading books that are almost exclusively dialogue the whole way through. But I felt it was pulled off really, really well. And the series starts off so well. If there's one book in the series that you have to read, that is the one must read that I should recommend to you, it would be Interview with the Vampire. It is that good. It's not the best in the series in my opinion, but it's pretty damn close. The next vampire book I'm going to talk about is actually an anthology, and that is I Am Legend and Other Stories by Richard Matheson. Originally, I Am Legend was reduced as a novella. It was just a pretty long short story, more or less. But these days, it's printed in a collection along with a lot of Matheson's other horror works. And it is the longest story in the collection. It's also one of the better ones, even though I will say that this collection is one of those things that it helped me understand horror as a genre better probably than most other books I've read. Not that I've read much horror, but... And that was pretty incredible, and just the sheer variety of the different types of stories in this horror anthology, that alone was pretty impressive. But also the fact that I Am Legend, being the book that it is, had such a huge influence on both vampire fiction and zombie fiction in general. And yeah, I did not expect to love I Am Legend the way that I did, and it remains one of the books that it's hard for me to forget, and it's very easy for me to forget stuff, but I Am Legend, I can't forget. It's just one of those quintessential books for vampirism and horror in general that you have to read. Man, I got this far and didn't even talk about what I Am Legend is. Oof, okay. So, I Am Legend follows a man who... he believes he's the last human alive after a virus basically wipes out humanity and brings them back as vampires. So he's basically cooped up in his house during the night while zombie-like vampires are just clawing around outside and trying to get inside to feed on him and kill him. And then during the day, he's going out and about collecting food, collecting resources, and trying to learn more about the vampires and the virus that created them so he could potentially find a cure. It's a very good scientific approach to vampirism that you don't normally see in fiction even these days, and was especially not a common way to write vampirism back in the 50s when that story was originally released. For those reasons alone, on top of just the prose and everything else in the book, I Am Legend is a book I will always be recommending to people. And then the last of the 4-star books I'm going to mention in this video is yet another Anne Rice novel, and that is Blood and Gold. Blood and Gold is the origin story of Marius. Marius was first introduced in the Vampire Chronicles in The Vampire Lestat as a vampire who's been around for a couple thousand years, as someone who chooses to mentor Lestat, in a way, who Lestat learned his name, decided to seek out. And the great thing about Anne Rice's origin story books, and particularly with Blood and Gold, is that we have so many other books in the series that give us bits and pieces of Marius's life, that Blood and Gold touches on the aspects of his life that we either didn't know about prior to the book, or it gives a different perspective on what we already know. So it feels fresh. It feels different, despite everything else that's been written so far up to that point. And it was, for me, it was the first Anne Rice book I owned. It was the second one I read, following the first one, Vittorio the Vampire. This one was the next one I read. And even with me not knowing that much about Marius back then compared to now, I still really enjoyed this book. It's not perfect by any stretch, but I find Marius to be a very intriguing character. And to learn more about what happened to him, all the mistakes he made along the way, to see him develop as a character over the many, many years that he has lived as a vampire is I'm not really one for historical fiction or anything, but this is a book that just, it kept me enthralled from start to finish. I was always wondering what would come next, and that, to me, is a plus. And now, here we come to the 5-star books. There are 2 books I read this year that I rated 5 stars. I cannot find any flaws in these books. They are just that good, in my opinion. Might differ from yours. And the first of these 2 books is The Vampire Lestat, the sequel to Interview with the Vampire. And Interview with the Vampire is the one people usually go to when they want to recommend a book by Anne Rice, but The Vampire Lestat, not only is it the first book in the series in which Lestat himself is the one telling you the story, out of many books since that have as well, but it takes everything about Interview with the Vampire that was good and great and makes it even better. And Interview with the Vampire is so close to a perfect book in my mind that when you do that and just make it better, like, The Vampire Lestat is... I am enthralled by this book over and over and over again, and just Lestat as a character is so interesting. It's a shame that a lot of the books that came since don't hold a candle to this one, because, like, if this book doesn't make you love Lestat, I don't know what will. It's just that good. And all it is his origin story. Just like Interview with the Vampire was Louis's origin story, The Vampire Lestat is Lestat's origin story. And it introduces you to some new characters. It doesn't take place over that long of a time frame either, but so much happens to Lestat in this time period. And when it does touch on stuff from Interview with the Vampire, it's very minimal and only what Lestat feels the need to expand upon or correct. But yeah, I don't think anything is going to push this book away as out of my top favorites of all time. It's that good, and even if you didn't like Interview with the Vampire, I would still recommend you read The Vampire Lestat. Because most of the things that people don't seem to like about Interview with the Vampire are either non-existent or expanded upon and explained in The Vampire Lestat. And then, finally, the second 5-star book I've read this year, and in my opinion, one of the best books ever, is Let the Right One In by John Avid Lindquist. Now, I will give a warning about this book that this one does deal with some heavy, heavy topics and issues. And although the protagonist of the book is a school-age boy, there is a lot of stuff that goes on in this book that is not appropriate for children. It is a horror novel through and through. Do not make the mistake of looking at the cover of the book and thinking it's a children's story. It is not, by any stretch. But the basic rundown is that you have this boy in Sweden named Oscar who befriends a vampire named Ellie. and all sorts of stuff happens. Probably, it's a really good book when it has a pedophile character in it, okay? And that's not going to be up some people's alley, and I totally understand. It's a very, very disturbing character, this guy. And yet the book is written so well that it didn't pull away from any of that at all. And just the stuff that happens, and it's such a commentary on, it tackles alcoholism in this. It tackles bullying to an extreme. Like, this kid is bullied something awful, and it's one of many things that makes me feel for Oscar. He's just such an incredible character. He goes through so much that the adults don't even know about. And the other thing that really, really brought this book around as just a classic of vampire fiction and a perfect vampire book in my mind is how the book revealed the truth about vampirism and how this author interprets vampirism and its origin. And I'm not going to say anything because it's a spoiler. My review for the video is also spoiler-free, by the way. But it's so different from what other books that came beforehand did. And yet, it just, the way it was done was so great. And I encourage you to pick up this book, whether it's audiobook, whether it's ebook, physical, doesn't matter. This is just, when people mention this book as one of the essential vampire novels to read, they are not kidding. Let the Right One In, or Let Me In, as some editions of the book are titled, such as the one I'm showing here. I can't recommend this book enough. With caveats, of course, because of the heavy topics in it, but you really need to read this book. Overall, I think, personally, out of all the books I read this year, this was a pretty good year. I read some great books, I read some horrible books, and the ones that were great were really, really great. Like, they were perfect or borderline perfect. I hope this trend continues, personally. I really love putting a spotlight on vampire fiction, and I love trying to find new favorites and rediscover old ones, and it's a very incredible journey for me to go through. I hope you enjoyed this video about the vampire books I read this year that I felt were amazing. I would like to hear about if there's any books that you read this year that you felt were incredible and should be recommended as well. It doesn't have to be vampire fiction, it could be literally any book you read this year that you loved. I'm curious to hear about it in the comments below. And with that, I would like to thank you for watching this video today, and I will talk to you later. Bye!